So we're going to be talking about supercharging sustainable supply chains, public-private partnerships that relate to decentralization and decarbonization. And I am thrilled to be joined by Satish Rao, who is the Chief Product Officer for Newlab. And for those of you just joining us, I'm Sarah Repucci. I'm the Global Head for Research Programs at Economist Impact. Satish, Newlab is spearheading efforts, as I mentioned in the title of this, to decarbonize and to decentralize supply chains. So maybe you could start by giving us a little bit of background on Newlab and tell us some of the initiatives that you're working on.
Yeah, totally. So we are a deep tech venture platform, and our entire role in the world is to help a variety of technology startups and entrepreneurs really push their solutions into the world of climate and reindustrialization. And we do that in three ways. The first is by applying unique infrastructure. So we have access and operate buildings that have on-site prototyping labs, and we have access to sites in and around the world where we can test and develop in the field and develop that kind of operational data you need to really create the right intervention. And then we invest in those companies. And the infrastructure part of it is really what pulls in the public-private partnerships that you mentioned. It allows us to launch projects that we hope will be adopted by enterprise, that are the ones driving this entire supply chain and logistics sort of challenges, right? So one example is in Michigan, where we opened up office last year, where with the Michigan Department of Transportation, State of Michigan, and our partners at Michigan Central, we launched an initiative around drones. So how do you advance air mobility in the state of Michigan? And so what are the conditions you need to do that, which is pretty much the model for Newlab. One, how do you promote the development of technology in your backyard, right? So there's funding mechanisms that we provide for grants to companies or researchers that want to develop that. Two, how do you find the right infrastructure needed in order to let those companies deploy in the field? Where can I fly a drone in New York? Where can I fly one to Detroit, and so on? And then three, how do you make it easy for enterprise to adopt those solutions based on that transparent data? And so what we've been able to work with the state of Michigan on is the stack of capital and infrastructure strategy to do all those things, making that state potentially the premier state in the United States to develop drone-based solutions for logistics and supply chain. So if you're a business in Michigan and you see an intervention that can be made in your supply chain or your logistics around using drones to ship goods, you can actually find that solution in Michigan one day itself. And so this is kind of a model we try to take around the world based on what those interventions need to be for supply chains and logistics.
So Newlab actually started in New York, but you're talking about what you're doing in Michigan. Tell us a little bit more about that model, sort of how you built the partnership in Michigan and also how it relates to what you're doing globally.
Totally. And so the learnings of what's happening in Michigan, of course, came from a lot of learnings that happened in New York. New York is our HQ. This is where we started. Our building was backed by a lot of public sources from the state and city level because there's an economic development story here as well, right? So if we're able to bring startups and companies from around the world that want to develop technologies and provide solutions to local enterprise and industries in a region, then those companies naturally grow. And that started first here in New York. And so, for example, we imagine an 84,000 square foot building in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. That building's been full for the last couple of years, but the real story is that companies have grown out of that building and taken on up to about 1 million square feet in Brooklyn itself. So the stickiness, because we're able to create the conditions for place-based innovation, is what's really been the magic sort of secret sauce for us from an economic development perspective. One example of a project we've been doing here in the city is around mobility and the movement of goods. And so we've been working with the city's New York Department of Transportation to understand how they can invest in infrastructure around delivery worker systems for delivery of goods in the last mile type scenario. So delivery workers in the city, a huge workforce in the city, as we all know, kind of dangerous right now in terms of their ability to be able to use electrified bikes. Where do they charge them? Where do they store them, and so on? So we're helping the DOT invest in the right infrastructure that allows these delivery workers to charge their systems in nodes across the city. So it takes the pressure off of them having to own that charging infrastructure themselves. And so how do you do that, right? And so you have to have policy. You have to be able to make an investment in infrastructure. You need the data to understand what that means. This is where we come in. By being able to launch the pilots with the solutions we think the city should be adopting to create these solutions for these delivery workers.
Tell us more about the data that you collect and kind of how that relates to solving these problems.
I think it's a great point. I saw some of that come from the earlier conversations. That data is critical for enterprise. So ultimately, anything related to climate tech, such as supply chain, logistics, we all know enterprise is the one that has to scale it, right? If you believe in really making a climate impact, you are not going to replace transportation industry. You're not going to replace the railroad industries and so on, right? We have to help them adopt these technologies. And so in our experience in getting these corporate partners to make the right decisions from an investment perspective requires data. And so I was just in the other room on the other side, and they were talking about how do CSOs work with CFOs to make the right investments. You need transparent data. I can show you a pitch deck of a cool drone or a cool battery swap technology that has a nice design on it, but how do I know what that's going to actually mean for the people I'm trying to serve? Does it have utility for delivery workers? Does the drone intervention actually solve a cost problem that I have with trucks? What is the investment I need to make? How does that pay back in the next 5 to 10 years? This is the data you can generate from a pilot to really prove. And a lot of the work we talk about, I know there's been a lot of discussion around digital, but most of the interventions needed for climate is physical. And so you have to feel it, you have to see it, and you have to imagine yourself living in that future state using those types of technologies. And that's what the data is able to provide from the pilots that we do.
So we're talking in this room this afternoon about supply chains. I want to relate this a bit to that, and in terms of these logistics networks and the energy efficiency that you're gaining through it, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the entire story really is about disaggregation, is how we think about it. So just speaking a bit more broadly, we think about the themes we work in terms of energy, mobility, and materials. The motion is really about decentralizing the way we produce and consume those things, right? The way we produce and consume electrons needs to be decentralized. The way we move goods and people needs to be decentralized and disaggregated. The way material flows work, same thing, right? So in mobility, if you look at, let's say, a network, typically you have very centralized nodes where our middle mile type segments that deliver kind of from production to central points of sort of distribution that then go out to another center that finally make it out to the last mile, right? And so these are very codified with big vehicles, big shipping type systems, rail, you name it, but it's very, very linear and very stuck. And this is causing huge issues. This causes congestion, quite literally. This causes huge energy efficiencies, right? So there's a couple things you can do. One, you can wait until all those things become electrified. Okay, so I'm waiting to electrify a truck one day. I can wait for that truck to be autonomous as well, right? But what are the interventions we can do today to make that a bit more disaggregated, right? And so can you use lightweight vehicles, for example, in urban road maps to help with the delivery? Can you fly drones across routes that will replace typical linear streets? We're working on one pilot right now with Stellantis. Stellantis has parts that are made in Windsor, Canada, that serve a factory in Detroit, Michigan. There is one bridge that serves that supply chain. Okay? Parts the size of a quarter sometimes get stuck for months because that bridge is blocked. I can fly that with a drone. Can I fly that with a drone? We'll find out, right? We're going to do that pilot. That pilot required data. The FAA needs to understand what that means in terms of how they regulate. The local state needs to have the right conditions to allow operators to fly across border and so on. And so that's a moment of massive disaggregation we can create, high energy efficiency, but in order to do that, we need the data needed to be able to make those right investments at the state level and the FAA.
Newlab thinks about sustainability in a holistic way, economic, social, and environmental together. Tell us how that relates to your engagement in supply chains.
So I think going back to either the New York or Michigan model as we talk about mobility, innovation, the movement of goods and people, ultimately, if we're able to create localized innovation in a way that the inventors that are creating that technology are serving initial customers in the region, we think that's really the flywheel that can be generated to create the economic development win, right? So let's just go back to Michigan, for example. Lots of logistics happening in Michigan. There's routes for shipping through the Great Lakes. You've got cross-border with Canada. You've got major highways that connect the east and the west that go through the state. So lots of opportunities for, let's say, decarbonizing corridors, right? Lots of opportunities for putting things in the air. And so if there is a market and a regulatory sandbox environment that promote the invention and adoption of those technologies, that should attract developers there. The developers being these startups that say, okay, that is the best place in the world for me to start my drone company. That is the best place in the world for me to deploy my first automated truck system. Why? Because the state has put together infrastructure across a 40-mile stretch, this is true, between Detroit and Ann Arbor to support AV. There is a stretch of road that has wireless charging implemented. There is a stretch of road that has 50 chargers installed, right? So the infrastructure to support these types of developments is what's needed. If you're able to do that, that's the economic development win. You kind of combine the R&D economy with this new industrialization economy, and that's how you put invention close to where the use is happening. We want to do the same thing in New York.
Interesting. shifting towards sustainability sometimes requires a cultural shift inside of a company. What is Newlab doing to help support that cultural shift among the suppliers it works with?
That is probably the hardest thing to do, and I do not have the entire answer, but I'll give you some suggestions of how things have worked and how they haven't. One of the things we've noticed is, and I'm going back to the panel on the other side of what's happening before this, when we see sustainability teams structured really well with the CFO of the business, we see a lot of great investment that then drives culture behavior in a really interesting way. So we're working with a major fleet owner in South America, as an example. That CFO has direct lines to the transportation team. That's the team that makes the decisions on what type of mobility units they put in their fleets. The corp dev team that makes the decision on how we're going to invest in those units, and then the sustainability team who signs off that this is a net positive in terms of carbon impact. Those three have the same line to the CFO. And that CFO is the one making the $500 million investment into electrifying their fleets. So to me, I think culture in some ways, one of the ways I think is driven by structural. Is a corporation really making a serious investment, and is that investment tied to a sustainability mandate? That creates the culture. And I see that happen firsthand when it's set up that way. In other ways, sustainability can be treated as more an advisory, right? This is the watch-outs. These are the policies you might need one day. But is it really tied to a real commitment of resources? That, to me, is usually the question, and then that tells me what the culture might be in that organization.
So looking ahead, what do you have your eye on for what Newlab can do in terms of advancing sustainability in the next 5, 10, 20 years?
20 years? Yeah, 20 years is a long time. So I think what we're noticing, and probably a lot of you are noticing as well, there's a lot of the regions in the world that are really moving towards this motion around reindustrialization, right? So what the region once was and what it's going to become in the future, and there's an amazing intersection between that and climate, right? And so let's take South America, some countries in South America, for example, that we operate in, like Uruguay. Uruguay's major export business is really around, using natural resources, unearthing those natural resources, and exporting to other people that want to consume them, right? So what is the reindustrialization of that country? Can we create sustainable value-added products from that country using innovation? Same in Michigan. Michigan was once a place that we invented cars. Then it became a place where we only made the cars. Invention was happening in the coasts. So how do you reindustrialize that state to become more of an entire value chain for mobility? Being an inventor of cars, an inventor of drones, all things related to mobility, that reindustrialization very much lines up with climate. I think Newlab can be at the center of that. And the reason for that is because a lot of the industrial R&D needed to make those things happen is actually moved to the world of startups, right? We don't have a Bell Labs anymore. We don't really have a GE Research anymore either. So we've got amazing academic institutions and this deep tech startup community that's really your industrial R&D. And that's the message you try to give to enterprise all the time. It's like, that's where your sources are to tap into. And so I think we've built a platform that can really promote that and help that research and technology move along in the right way.
Fascinating. Well, thank you so much for the conversation, for sharing these thoughts, and I will invite Phil Cornell up to the stage.
Thanks for your questions.